On my first day as a Harvard freshman in the fall of 1977, my roommate, Richard Ismach, pulled a cassette tape out of his pocket. He put it in the machine and he pressed play, and music started to come out. It was a bootleg Grateful Dead tape. Richard started to rock back and forth, and he got a faraway look in his eyes. And I looked at Richard and I listened to the music, and I started to rock back and forth too. Richard and I were imprinting onto the Grateful Dead like baby ducklings. And we decided right then and there that we had to see them in concert as soon as possible. And it was possible because the Grateful Dead were a touring band, but this was September and they weren't coming around until May. So to keep ourselves occupied, in the meantime, Richard and I practiced juggling. This was also Richard's fault, because that same first day at Harvard, he taught me how to juggle. Richard had long, black, curly hair and a big, bushy beard. He was from Minneapolis via San Francisco, and his accent kind of represented both regions. He would stroke his beard and say, "Yeah, sure, I can get into it." I really liked the guy, and he was a pretty good juggler too. He had these big, long, hairy arms and huge hands. And he juggled slow motion, California style. It almost looked as if the balls were being held aloft by invisible marionettes. It was completely mesmerizing. So I practiced juggling and I became kind of a fanatic. And I carried juggling balls with me everywhere I went. So May finally rolled around and Richard and I went down to Providence to see the Grateful Dead for the first time at the Civic Center. And when the lights came up and the band started to play, I began to have revelations. And the strongest of these was I had a vision of myself juggling in the future. Not just the near future, but down the road. Because the Grateful Dead had been doing this for a long time, following their passion, and they had gotten really good. And they traveled all around the country, and everywhere they went, people were dancing ecstatically. And this was their job. This was nothing like Harvard. And when the band was playing Sugar Magnolia and the crowd was singing Sunshine Daydream, I looked over to my right and there was a girl with new moon eyes with diamonds in them. And our eyes met and she smiled at me. So naturally I pulled out 3 juggling balls and I began to juggle. And she laughed and she tossed her hair back over her shoulder in a rainbow waterfall. This was turning into a great concert. And at the end of the night, I introduced myself to her, and her name was Vincent. And she went to Brown University, another Ivy League school right there in Providence, about an hour from Harvard. But all concerts end. And at the end of the night, Richard and I had to go back to Harvard to study for our spring term exams. But I did not forget Vincent, and I did not forget my vision at the Grateful Dead concert. And the following fall, Vincent and I started to see each other. And at the end of that school year, she decided to take a year off and study French in Paris. That's when I had the idea. I was going to follow her over to Paris, and I was going to juggle on the streets for a living, thus fulfilling my destiny as laid out for me by the Grateful Dead. And I did. I followed her over to Paris, and we rented a small apartment near the Pompidou Center, which is an art center with a lot of street performers on a plaza. I carved out 3 flaming torches out of broomsticks using asbestos. And I went to the hardware store, and I bought 3 machetes so that I could juggle them to keep the crowd. And I was able to make a living passing my hat for tips and donations that entire winter in Paris. And then in the spring, Vincent and my new French friend, Van Fu, and I traveled all over Southern Europe, performing on the streets as the V&V Trio. We went to Spain, Italy, Greece, Austria, Switzerland, Germany. I remember a magical day in Heidelberg, performing on the streets. We made almost $500. People were coming up to us and giving us baskets of fruit and bottles of wine, and inviting us to spend the night at their houses. This was the life I had desired. This was nothing like Harvard. But all trips end. And in the fall of 1991, I went back to Harvard to finish my study of psychology. You know when you go to sleep and you have a dream, and it's really realistic, and you wake up and you try and remember the dream, but as your day goes on, the dream fades away? Well, that's how my year in Europe was becoming those last 2 years at Harvard. It was fading away. I was no longer confident of my ability to realistically make a living juggling. Harvard and psychology were winning. Grateful Dead and juggling were losing. And graduation came around, and Richard applied to and got into medical school. Vincent graduated from Brown, and she went off to California to study medical anthropology. And I was left out in the cold with a vision and 3 juggling balls, but no plans. Now, my parents have always been very supportive of my dreams, but my mom gently suggested that maybe I should buy a couple of suits to impress potential employers with my mature appearance. I just couldn't reconcile the juggling and the Grateful Dead on one hand and the Harvard and the psychology on the other. It was like they were mutually exclusive. There's actually a term for that in psychology. It's called cognitive dissonance. There's a term for it in the Grateful Dead community too. It's called a bad trip. I knew what I wanted to be and what I wanted to do. I just didn't think there was realistically any place for me to be that person or do that thing. But then something miraculous happened. My friend Shelley, that I had met at the DC Jugglers Club in DuPont Circle, invited me to join her at the Gypsy Camp at the Maryland Renaissance Festival, which at that time was in Symphony Woods in Columbia, Maryland. And I became Nicolo the Gypsy Juggler. And I met a woman who juggled, Joanne. She was performing as the Queen of Whimsy. And we traveled for 10 years on the Renaissance Fair circuit. But here's the thing. Youth comes to an end. And now I'm 54 years old, and I have to work for a living. My job? My job is this little juggling act that I've been performing for kids and families for the last 30 years, called the Nicolo Whimsy Show with my wife, Joanne. Because concerts end, and trips end, and even youth ends. But some sunshine daydreams just keep on trucking. Thank you.